And I also just want to acknowledge our colleague, Bobby Trice, who is an integral part of the Quaker Coalition on Uprooting Racism, and unfortunately was not able to be with us this evening. But we are thinking of him as well as we hold this conversation. And with that, I invite you to begin our time with some settling and a few moments of grounding silence. Then we will get started. Thank you, friends. So I want to start with just a little bit about why we wanted to have this conversation. In the popular imagination, Quakers are these amazing people who are always on the right side of history. I'm sure you've encountered that view. People look at abolition, women's rights, the work against the Vietnam War, and that is true. And also, Quakers, also have this capacity to see things differently, and that's something that our practices and processes give us the capacity to do. This summer, Lauren and I wrote an article in Friends Journal about Quaker process and FCNL's work, and the subtitle of that article was "Countercultural Leadership for the World We Seek." And that's really, what Quakers can do with the tools that we've been given. And I'll just put that link in the chat in case you're interested. And also, Quakers are just as susceptible as anyone else of being influenced by the culture we're living in. Many of you are probably familiar with Vanessa, Julye, and Donna McDonald's book, Fit for Freedom, Not for Friendship, which really did a lot of groundbreaking look at how that has played out around the issue of racial justice. And we also have this testimony of integrity that is calling us back and asking us to look at the alignment of our faith and practice. That's work FCNL is doing as we think about, how does this work for the world we seek show up in the relationships we have with each other, not just in what we're telling other people to do. And the Quaker Coalition for Uprooting Racism is a really exciting and important avenue for imagining what friends could be and helping us get there together. It evolved from a vision of a connected web of Quaker communities challenging racial justice disparities through disruptive action and structural change. That's like a really bold thing that this group is trying to do. And the steering committee brings together representatives from FCNL, American Friends Service Committee, Pendle Hill, Friends Council on Education, Quaker Voluntary Service, and Friends General Conference, which is a wide group of Quaker organizations. And it's really the way I think about it is, how do we get our own house in order? How do we not just settle for we're better than most people or better than most communities in our meetings, in our churches, in our organizations? And how do we build trusting relationships and listen to the voices of people who aren't already comfortable within our society? This is important work both for Friends' integrity and the evolution of our faith community. And it's really challenging work to hear that maybe we're not as evolved as we sometimes think we are, or others think we are. So I'm really excited for this conversation. And to get us started, Linnea, you were part of the Quaker Coalition's first steering committee, and Lauren, you are currently on the steering committee. So I'd love for you both to reflect on what drew you to this coalition work originally and what your experience has been with the group. And Linnea, I'll turn it over to you first.
Yeah, thank you, Alicia. And it's really good to be with all of you tonight. Somehow I got muted. Sorry about that. I think such a big part of the work of coalition building is coming together around this very important issue for our friends and our community. And so having you all here tonight to join us and learning just more and how to get involved potentially feels like the embodiment of this kind of work that we're hoping to do. So I just want to thank you for that. And to me, I was so lucky. So I worked with Vanessa Julye, and she's my supervisor. And so originally I was kind of joining this group to take a lot of notes on the steering committee. And then they're like, oh yeah, you're here. You're part of the steering committee. And so at the time, the original steering committee was with Francisco Burgos from Pendle Hill, Deborah Saenz Pancos from Friends Council on Education, Vanessa, myself, and Lucy Duncan. And it all came out of a conversation with Lucy Duncan and Vanessa Julye in 2018, just this imagining of what would it mean. Lucy at the time was working at AFSC, American Friends Service Committee, and Vanessa was at Friends General Conference, and they're realizing, wow, there's so many parallels as we try and uproot racism from our organizations. What if we work together? What if we had a way to unite friends from all different organizations, from all the meetings across the US that are concerned about this? And so they got together, this original steering committee, and had a lot of visioning sessions of what could this mean? What could this look like? And came out with a cohort model originally. And just being in the coalition, to me, as someone that I'm 26, I'm young, and I'm learning a lot as I do this anti-racism work and how to uproot this from systems that are ingrained, have it so ingrained in so many ways that feel so overwhelming at times. It felt like, as I was grappling with it, and then had these other people that are doing the same grappling alongside me, it felt like taking a deep breath of sometimes exhaustion, other times concern, and then also excitement and energy in this visioning that we all are hoping to move towards when it comes to uprooting racism, and sharing concrete ways that we're doing it, and remembering that we don't need to reinvent wheels, we can share in this. So I kind of want to pass it over though to Lauren, who's on the current steering committee, because it's grown since then. And I want her to share more on who's a part of it now.
Thank you. It is wonderful to be with all of you. And Linnea and I met on this steering committee. And so that is a great joy to hear about those early days of Linnea's work on that. And I am someone who started associating my Quaker identity and my work toward racial justice when I was a student at Sidwell Friends School in DC. And then also when I, after college, started working at Sidwell Friends School in DC. And right from the beginning of my time as an educator, have been on some version of a diversity committee every year for the last 19 years. And so this has just been a part of my life, and much of my work until I started at FCNL a year ago was in Quaker schools. And so this work of racial justice has been really essential to that, and then has also fed into my work within my own meeting, Bethesda Friends meeting in Maryland. And one of the stories that I think about of that early association is, as Black Lives Matter was really taking off, and I felt such a leading to have that work be alive in my meeting, and suggested that we create our own flyer that we passed out in downtown Bethesda, Maryland, that said, here's why we as Quakers support Black Lives Matter. And that work at the time was really interesting because the meeting, because of the Quaker take on not wanting to proselytize, said, is it proselytizing if we put that this is coming from Bethesda Friends meeting and that this is what we believe? as Bethesda Friends meeting. And I said, no, I think this is really a way to help people see who Quakers are, and help people to see if they might have an affinity to the way that we see this work of racial justice. And so for me, this work has been really connected all the way along. And so in the first year of the Quakers Uprooting Racism cohort, I was asked to be on the program committee to help support the work of the cohort, which was a joy. And I got sort of a taste for the work. And then when I started my role at FCNL in the summer of 22, one of the first requests that came across my desk was, would you be on the steering committee? We would like FCNL to be represented on the Quaker steering committee. And that was an invitation for both me and Bobby Trace, who had been a part of the cohort, and then was asked through his role to be on the steering committee as well. And so we have both loved representing FCNL in that work, because the work of thinking about how we build beloved community is something that FCNL thinks about all the time throughout the work that we are doing. And so Bobby and I have since become co-clerks of the steering committee, along with Francisco from Pendle Hill. And at the same time that Bobby and I joined the steering committee, Quaker Voluntary Service was also invited to join the steering committee. And so Zenaida Peterson has also been a member of the steering committee. And then also in the evolution, both Lucy and Vanessa have now stepped away from the steering committee, and they have colleagues who have stepped up in their places. So at FGC, it is Hanaye and Shayna who are on the ministry on racism team with Vanessa, who are now steering committee members, and then Maggie Fogarty and Willie Colon of AFSC, who are representing that work. And so it has been wonderful to see the work of the steering committee evolve with new voices, but hold on to that same core that we are all building beloved community together. And I think it has been such a space of doing what I think many of us preach all the time, which is that we have to be practicing beloved community as we're seeking to build beloved community. And that space of the steering committee is a place where people are vulnerable, where people are brave, where we are working through things together in a way that feels really respectful, and that we can disagree about things or share what's hard for us, but in a way that never feels like we're against each other. We're so clear that we're all in this work of building beloved community together, and that has just been such a joy.
Thanks. Thank you, Lauren and Linnea. And I also, I know that I often hear when I travel among friends, some sense of, oh, there are all these Quaker organizations and, the Quaker alphabet soup, and, why am I hearing from you and you and you and you? Why aren't you working together? And I think this coalition is a really good example of the ways that we are, bringing together. Lauren, did you want to add to that?
Yes, I forgot that the other addition at the same time that Bobby and Zenaida and I joined the steering committee was also that Francis Kramer from Pendle Hill, who had been on the program committee with me, also evolved into being a steering committee member and has been a really essential steering committee member. So I didn't want to leave her out either.
Oh, great. Thank you for catching that. Yeah. So just like this is a way that, Quaker organizations are also realizing that we're all facing some of the same questions and challenges, and how do we, not be in competition with each other for some of the work we're doing, and how do we really work together. But I want to come back, to the name of this coalition. It's Quakers Uprooting Racism, or Quaker Coalition for Uprooting Racism. And this uprooting racism idea that's pretty bold. So I would love to hear you talk a little bit about what that means. How is that not just anti-racism? How does that go a little deeper? And what have you seen? Where are some examples of this work that you've seen in the Religious Society of Friends?
Yeah, thank you. So the Quaker Coalition for Uprooting Racism Steering Committee did try and really articulate this, and it took so many drafts and again, just like when we say uprooting, what is our vision? What does that look like? What does that mean to us? And how do we put that into a mission? You know, the classic mission, vision, theory of change. We spent some really great intentional time to really clarify that. So when people approach Quaker Coalition for Uprooting Racism, they understand what we're moving towards. And so I wanted to read that and just share that with you all. And I encourage you to maybe close your eyes, ground with your feet, however you feel led to kind of really take this in and listen to the words and notice what arises in your body if there are reactions to it. But I'll start with reading the vision. We envision a liberatory, spirit-led Quaker community that is deeply transforming, co-creative, and continually promoting racial justice through dismantling white supremacy within the Religious Society of Friends and beyond. Reimagine Quaker communities living into their integrity will embody these principles and characteristics. Commitment to creating and sustaining liberatory spaces with an understanding that all of our liberation is connected. Living our faith as a transforming force in the world. Engaging in open-hearted conflict, understanding that conflict is an essential aspect of healthy community. Acting from an understanding that inward transformation is necessary for racial justice, and that working for racial justice is necessary for inward transformation. Centering the voice, dignity, and well-being of those most at the margins of our communities, considering place and legacy with attention towards Black and Indigenous people. Confronting the reality of our history, making repair for the damage we have done, and lifting up prophetic voices from our past. Reckoning with and acting on Quakers' historical and ongoing role in perpetuating global Christian hegemony and related acts of racial injustice, colonization, and cultural genocide. Consciously using power and making decisions equitably, and releasing the energy bound in Quaker institutions' patterns, supporting the status quo, and calling in their organizational power towards racial justice. So that is the vision that we want. That's what uprooting racism would look like to us. And that's what the embodiment of it is. And then our mission is we bring together a community of practice of racial justice change makers to support one another in working within our Religious Society of Friends. These racial justice practitioners model and move toward the vision articulated above through embodied spiritual practice and mindful action within and beyond Quaker communities. The community of practice builds trusting relationships with one another, collectively names and develops strategies to dismantle white supremacy and foster root-level change, meaning rather than performative change. And skill builds towards change strategies, actively experiments with them, and brings learnings from those actions back to the group. So to move that vision forward, what we have articulated our Quaker Coalition for Uprooting Racism is being really a place for the racial justice change makers to support one another, working within the Religious Society of Friends and beyond, but really having this kind of cycle where we can come back to one another, practice change making in our home meetings and our home institutions, all of those, and bringing those learnings back and feeding those to the rest so that we can keep having this cycle of trust and relationship building and skill building and knowledge building. And so that's really kind of what, when we're saying Quaker Coalition for Uprooting Racism, that is how we are trying to enact it as a coalition. And what that looks like, just with like now more structural things, is we have a steering committee, which we just shared. We have subcommittees. So that, like Lauren said before, she was on the steering committee. She was part of a subcommittee that helped with programming. There's also like a fundraising subcommittee, and those committees can also have volunteers. So people from our last cohort are now populating some of those subcommittees. So there's a way for them to stay involved in the Quaker Coalition's work. And then we have these cohorts that we'll talk more about later. And we have co-facilitators for those. So that's kind of like the structure of like, what are the bodies that are making this all happen? Yeah, and I'll pass along to Lauren to talk more about what uprooting racism is and how it connects to Quaker.
Yeah, I have some examples of what uprooting racism looks like in the Quaker community, in some ways beyond Quaker. So I think one of the things we want to be clear about, that I always like to say about Quakerism in general, is that I don't think any of us want to say that we have the answers, and Quaker is similar, that we are not saying, here's the one right way to do this. And so there are certainly examples of Quakers uprooting racism that are separate from the work that Quaker is doing. And so I wanted to lift up first in my yearly meeting, Baltimore yearly meeting, that we have for a good number of years now had anti-racism queries that we are asked to consider in any decision-making that we do. And so that is at the top of agendas of different committees. They are introduced in our annual sessions. It is part of the life of Baltimore yearly meeting, and it has become then a part of the life of Bethesda Friends meeting, and many of the other monthly meetings that are a part of the yearly meeting. So similarly, in my monthly meeting, as we are in meeting for worship with attention to business, we always try to ground ourselves at the very beginning and what is the impact of the decisions that we're making in terms of our thinking of ourselves as an anti-racist community, and how are we living into that? How are we thinking of the impacts of our decisions on those who might be marginalized, who might not have voice in this community in the same way? How are we making sure that we're centering the needs of the vulnerable among us? And so that is one way that I think that has been happening without Quaker, and that is an example of Quakers trying to be aware of that anti-racist lens, and then use that to uproot the racism that we have within our communities. A similar uprooting that I think comes from our raised consciousness, I think of FCNL's work in supporting meetings and thinking about the truth and healing work around the Indigenous boarding schools from many years ago, and how Quakers now are saying, even if people had good intentions around that, the impact was really a lot of harm that continues to live on. And so we need to recognize what role Quakers had in that, and take ownership of that, and work to heal that now, both by writing minutes to acknowledge our role in it, by advocating for a Truth and Healing Commission for Congress to support, and the bill that supports that legislation. And so thinking about that awareness raising and then acting on that is a way of uprooting racism as well. And then my final quick example just from Quaker and what has happened since Quaker is that some of the friends who were in the first cohort and who lead clerking workshops have thought about, particularly Steve Mulkey and O, who were in that first cohort, have thought about how do they incorporate what they've learned about anti-racism into how to engage in anti-racist clerking. And again, how do we have that same lens, that awareness, and use that awareness to be intentional about how to integrate these principles into how we live out our Quaker principles and practices. And so that is an example of taking some of these lessons from Quaker and thinking about it in community, and thinking about how to apply that back into the work that we're already doing. So those are some of my examples of uprooting.
Great, thank you. Yes. So I would just encourage friends, if you have questions or things you would like to our speakers to address to please share those in the chat, and we'll try to get to those. And I do know we have a hard stop at 1:30 because Lauren actually has another speaking engagement. So I want to make sure we get to as much as we can. I'm wondering if maybe you could share quickly about what Quaker is doing now, and if there's particular things friends could get involved in. And maybe share some, yeah, great. Thank you, Linnea, for the link. I was going to suggest a link.
Yes, thank you very much for sharing that link. And I would say the things that I am really excited about that Quaker is working on now include, we have a newsletter that people can sign up for through the website. We're starting to think about holding worship sharing sessions for people to share more broadly about the work that they are doing in their own communities to uproot racism. We obviously are always thinking about fundraising, and so we are happy to get donations from individuals and meetings. We've had a number of meetings that have supported our work, and that's been really essential to keep that going. And part of what our donations go to is supporting the cohort work that we have. So we have this 9-month cohort. The next one is starting in January, so next month, and we'll go through September 2024 with friends from all around the country. And it's both capital F friends, but then also folks who are in Quaker communities who might not be members of the Religious Society of Friends, but are still important parts of our Quaker community, all coming together with some retreats at Pendle Hill, but also work each month to keep deepening our understanding of what it means to uproot racism in our Quaker lens. And that work is led by Lisa Graustein and Dwight Dunstan, who are very well-respected friends and who I have gotten to learn a lot from in a range of ways over the years. And the one other thing that I will name is the work that the steering committee has done this year on what is called our Racial Wounding and Racial Justice in Quaker Communities guide. And it has what we have experienced and heard from other friends about patterns of racial harm, such as conflict avoidance, being guardians of the status quo, denying that oppression exists within the Quaker community, performative racial justice work, and a challenge with our relationship with time. And we have talked about the ways that those harms show up in Quaker communities, and then what our advices are in terms of showing up differently, having racial justice be the motivator for what we do in that work. And so that guide, and we can make sure that that goes in the chat as well, is a great resource for communities to use to think about how to be intentional, again, raising this awareness so that we can act in ways that best reflect our values and demonstrate that integrity that we ever seek to live into.
Great. Linnea, do you want to add anything to that?
I think Lauren covered most of it, and
Okay.
yeah.
All right. So I want to talk about the other half of the title of the coalition, which is Quaker. You know, racial justice work is, you know, a lot of people are doing it. I know there's been a lot of talk about, you know, the sort of post George Floyd, you know, uptick and people being concerned about these things, and is that going to be sustained, and sort of, so I would love to get your sort of perspective on what makes this work distinctly Quaker, and why is it so important that, you know, what sort of hole is this filling in this racial justice work that that is happening?
I will speak very briefly this time since I got to go into more detail for the last question, but I will just share that for me, some of the ways that this work has reflected my own sense of foundational Quaker principles is that there's a real focus on answering that of God and everyone in the way that we approach this work, in the commitment to beloved community building. And that also reflects the testimonies of integrity, community, equality, equity, I think, as many of us now think of that testimony. And those ideals are really at the center of all that we do. And that commitment to continuing revelation, that we are doing the best that we can and we keep learning and growing, and that we're committed to applying what we learn to continue to do the work with ever more integrity. Linnea, what about you?
Yeah, as a young adult, I have felt and seen with so many peers that are so concerned with so much social justice and so many climate catastrophes, really not having a place to root and ground in. And to me, I've always known, if I'm going to do social justice work, if I'm going to do these really hard, painful things, and not do, I guess, engage with in a really confronting way, I need some spiritual grounding. I need some community. I need some ways to get support. And the ways that Quakers have built out processes and practices for support, for grounding, just to me goes hand in hand with this work. And I think is something that is so beautiful about Quakerism, and why Quakers are often the ones that can be at the front lines, beyond the front lines, is I think we have practices that have really supported us in doing that. And so I think this is just it feels very Quaker to be really grappling with these things and talking about uprooting. That is a very physical, big thing. That's not like, it's not planting trees, it's uprooting. How do we take up, and how do we really do that? I said in our notes, a spirit-led approach with teeth, which might be a little violent for Quakers, but just taking action in that is spirit-led. And to me, those go hand in hand. And what this cohort has done, when I was in the first cohort, I was really lucky. We identified polarities within the Religious Society of Friends with Lisa and Nionu, who were the facilitators at the time. So we talked about how can be two things that exist and are true at once. And sometimes we can really feel those tensions. So some examples of that are, we want to stay in community and we want to challenge racist behavior out loud. And sometimes it feels like those things are at odds, but those are both truths. And they are not always inherently against each other, but it can feel like there's this tension between the two. We also identified core beliefs within the Religious Society of Friends that need to be addressed. So we talked about some people believe God is white, and some people think that white friends, like the Religious Society of Friends, belongs to white people. Some people believe anti-racism only benefits people of color, BIPOC people. And so these are things that we were discovering and uprooting within our home communities, within some of our organizations, or things that we were dealing with or hearing from different people, and really realizing that those core beliefs are things that we need to uproot and we need to address within our community, specific the Religious Society of Friends. And this isn't saying that this is within every group, but these were trends that we saw and named. And so those are just some examples. But what is making this work really Quaker is it's also very rooted in Quaker community. And those were the examples of how we were really getting specific about the Religious Society of Friends. And then throughout that, having silent times and different support practices and eldering throughout the entire time, which was so grounding for the cohort. So yeah, I need to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Linnea. So before we turn to a few questions, I would love for you to each share a story, an example of the work you've done with Quaker and on anti-racism and Quaker communities that exemplifies the power of this work.
Yeah, my example is not Quaker directly related, but I think exemplifies the Quaker model, which is that answering to God and everyone, acting relationally, which is that a good few years ago now, I was on the first iteration in Baltimore yearly meeting of what is called the Growing Diverse Leadership Committee, that was trying to do this kind of work at our yearly meeting level. And we were trying to get baseline demographic information from monthly meetings, particularly around race and age. And my meeting was not comfortable with that. People were feeling like they did not want to be categorized by race. And I remember I was in a Peace and Social Justice Committee meeting, and I had heard that in the pastoral care meeting, someone had been really clear about how this was not something that they were comfortable with. And I said something along the lines of, I'm really going to have to question if you're hearing from young people and people of color that this is a need that there is in our community, and people who are part of the sort of core of Quaker demographics are saying, no, we don't want to lean into these things that are being identified by these people who we're trying to, in theory, listen from to continue to grow our Quaker community, then it makes me wonder whether, if people aren't open to that kind of continuing revelation, is this the right spiritual community for me? And about a week later, I heard from the person who in the pastoral care meeting had said, I won't do it. He called me and he said, I heard that you felt this strongly about it, and I wanted to talk through it with you. And we had this just wonderful, powerful talk where I said, I do not, if you are telling me, which is what he was telling me, that it was a prophetic leading that he had, that he should not recognize race. And I said, I do not want to question your prophetic leading. And I can tell you what solidarity looks like to me in the work that I try to do with solidarity, which is listening to the people who are most affected by the issues that I'm trying to be in solidarity with, and following their lead on how to create change in these ways. And to that member of my meeting, that really changed his paradigm, shifted his paradigm around this. And he not only said to me, that makes so much sense, and I hear you on this, but he went on to be the model of solidarity work in not only our monthly meeting, but our yearly meeting, and became a real influence to others in helping them to understand the ways that we need to listen to each other and be open to getting ministry from each other in these ways. And to me, that's at the core of what makes this work Quaker, and what the power of it is, that we're not saying I'm right and you're wrong, but we're actually trying to listen to each other and learn and grow in community.
Yeah. And before Linnea tells her story, I would just want to point out that, like, I also think it's really interesting that the transformative moment happened. Like, this was sort of a game of telephone where, like, you heard he said this and he heard you said this, but then he, when you were able to actually talk together, that was when transformation happened. And I think that, speaking to the sort of patterns that we notice in our communities, like noticing when, we're not directly addressing the conflict, or we're hearing what other people are saying about something and engaging with it that way. So I think that's also a really powerful.
I do want to point out, his name was not shared with me. So I had not gone to him because of my avoiding it, but the way it was carried to me was in our pastoral care meeting, this was shared.
Yeah. that's often how it is. All right, Linnea, what about you?
I said my relationships are the things that sustain me because they just they're so supportive, and we're social creatures. I'm so reminded that we're just animals sometimes, especially during the winter. And I just, when I have been able to connect with people, especially throughout Quaker organizations that are doing this work and grappling with this work and connecting to them and feeling not alone in it and learning that there's resilience and support when we can connect around that and trusting those things to guide us. I mean, again, Lauren, I'm here because I met Lauren through Quaker. There's all these just parallels, and again, these conversations and relationships, you don't know where they're going to go, but they do pop up at really big opportune times. We talked about, Lauren mentioned earlier, Steve Mulkey and two people met on the Quaker Coalition for Uprooting Racism, and now we're talking about anti-racist clerking practices. And I see these people cycle in and out. I saw Ernie Buscemi on this call, who was in the coalition, and just knowing these people and being able to have our worlds collide in different ways at different times is one of the more magical things that gives me a lot of hope and a lot of resilience in this work.
Great, thank you so much. So I haven't seen any questions come through the chat, but I know that we had some questions that were shared in advance when you all RSVP'd to this event. And there was sort of a trend in some of the questions, I think people sort of feeling that there's resistance in their communities to some of these ideas, or, different sort of objections that their meeting or yearly meeting is having to thinking about naming anti-racism as a focus. And I guess I was wondering if you could, one or both of you could speak to sort of some of the challenges of this work and maybe some conversation starters or suggestions on how people might address sort of pushback on this kind of work. Who wants to take that one?
I can start, and I think that the story that I told is a version of that too, which is that, again, I try to never begin by saying, here's the one right way to do this. I always try to open with what my vision is for friends, for the world, that I think by thinking about what our shared values are, and being able to speak from an I perspective about how I see this work as living into my Quaker principles, and how I try to do this work with integrity to my identity as a friend. I think that is often a way that people come to understand that that we're not having to choose between Quaker tradition or ways that people have seen or experienced a version of Quakerism, that as Bridget Moix has often said, that being more diverse makes us more Quaker. And I think helping people to understand how those things are aligned, that it's not trying to make Quakerism a totally different identity, but trying to think about what's really at the heart of our Quaker principles and practices, and how does answering to that of God within everyone around us in order to build beloved community actually help us to live out those principles and practices with ever more integrity.
The only thing I will add to that is just learning that continuing revelation, and we are learning. There's no, Lauren has said this multiple times, there's no one right way. and we are constantly experimenting. And that's how I like to approach anytime I'm doing anything that is trying to help move us towards more anti-racism, more beloved community ultimately. We're experimenting, people. We are testing things out, and we are listening to hear if they're working, and really being humble in the way of trying to ground in spirit. To me, this is why Quakerism is so beautiful, and doing this in a spirit-based place is so essential, is when we're acting within as close as we can to spirit and with alignment in that, we're more likely to be able to attune to things, change things as they need to be changed, and be led in a loving way towards beloved community. But there are I remind myself this when I can't, if I'm feeling tugged out of beloved community just with myself, I'm not going to be able to help embody that in the rest of, in other communities. And so it is such a, it always is both and this work, and really being willing to mess up. But as long as you can try and ground as much as you can in what you're feeling called to do when it comes to building beloved community, and letting that guide, and trusting that leading is a good leading, and that it's going to be imperfect because that's, we're human. I think that is like the most, those are the two things I try and hold, is like grounding in spirit, and knowing I'm experimenting, and I want to experiment in community, with consent of community, but that it's going to be really beautifully imperfect. And sometimes it doesn't feel beautiful, and that's okay.
Yeah, something that I think about is like, you know, the history I mentioned, you know, people have this idea of Quaker history and all the great things, you know, when we're looking at that from the perspective of 200 or 100 years ago, like it's easy to sort of tell this lovely story about it. And I'm sure that the people, you know, living that experience and, you know, wrestling with their sense of leading on this work, it was not pretty. And it wasn't this like nice story that we tell ourselves. And so like giving ourselves the grace of you know, doing the work in the moment, and knowing that, you know, maybe 100 or 200 years from now, people will tell a nice story about us too. Lauren, I would love to close with, I know Linnea spoke a little bit about the sustaining, you know, what sustains her in this work. And I just would love to hear your reflection before I turn things back to Micah and we wrap up for the evening.
Thank you. I think, and this goes a little bit to Bridget's question in the chat as well, but I think there's this sense of, I agree with Linnea, the joys of doing this work in community. And I think that can look all sorts of different ways. But I think that is one of the core lessons from Quaker, is that we're all learning from each other. And then the hope that I see and what sustains me is both those people, but it's also the wins. And I think often we look at what are the things we could be doing better. And I know, Alicia, you and I have had this conversation a lot, that we can always look at the work and say, here's what more we can and should be doing. And I sort of hope that we're always doing that, right? Anyone who thinks that they're done with this work, I have concerns about. And so that sense of always thinking about what comes next, how do we get closer to our ideals around beloved community, but then taking the time to look at what the wins are. And to me, thinking about the years that I have been engaged with FCNL, how much FCNL has grown in its commitment to this work, and that at both FCNL and in my monthly meeting, from a lot of really intentional work in this area, from a lot of learning and awareness raising, people have so much more capacity right now to recognize when they can be a part of a solution. I think people we're more aware of what kinds of things can potentially be harmful to other people, and that people aren't just saying, why do we have these problems, but are thinking of what agency they have to lovingly share, here's how I think we could take this moment and reflect on how it connects with our principles, and bring people. I think people think often about a fear of being called out. And I think the more we practice calling each other in and saying, I love you, and here's a way I think you can be your best self. Here's a way I think we can collectively be our best selves, and hold each other in love as we grow and make space for those mistakes. That is, seeing more and more examples of that brings me so much hope, is what sustains me in the work. It's how I know we're getting there. And I think, to me, that's also what Quaker embodies.
Thank you, Lauren. And I do know we did have I see Jack's question in the chat, and we did have some questions about like specific tactics and things like that. And let me just see if I understand. My understanding of Quaker's work is that it's really about sort of how do we create the grounding to, as a community, test what the right tactics are. So my understanding is that we're not like saying here's the right tactic or the wrong tactic, but it's sort of like, how do we build that understanding of how we know? Is that fair?
And certainly sometimes that looks like reparations. I think that is an absolutely a tactic that has been successful for some communities. And I think Green Street Meeting in Philadelphia is a great example of that. And Lucy Duncan, who was one of the founders, her new organization is called Reparation Works. And actually my meeting just brought them in to do a racial justice journey with us over the course of 6 months. And so highly recommend, if you are interested in learning more about that, looking up Reparation Works.
Thank you so much, Lauren. And as we close, as I mentioned, Lauren is actually speaking on a call with Friends Journal in 3 minutes. And so I am going to release Lauren so that she can take a breath and stand up and get some water before her next engagement. She's a very popular speaker. Thank you so much. And then I will thank all of you for being part of this conversation, and turn things back to Micah for a few reminders. And I will also just say that I know we were sharing a lot of words and links and things in the chat, and we will send out an email to everyone that signed up for this call so that we can, get you that information so you don't have to frantically scroll through the chat to try to find it. Micah, over to you.
Hello, friends again. Before we conclude this event, I just wanted to share a couple of opportunities that if you are interested in this work and want to get involved, we thought to share them with you as we're holding this space. So the one that I just sent is what Alicia mentioned. Lauren is hopping onto probably now as we speak. I sent the Zoom link in there if you want to attend and register for that event, or if I encourage you to do so. Additionally, if you would like to sign up for the Quaker newsletter, please do. And I am sending that now as well. And I'm sending them now if you want to look at them now. But as Alicia said, we will send all of these in a link afterwards. Also, if you enjoyed hearing what Lauren had to say, she will be speaking on January 8th at Pendle Hill First Monday Lecture. It will be Lauren Brownlee and Zenaida discussing racial wounding and racial justice in Quaker communities. So this is a project coming from Quaker, so this general coalition that they will be doing this work. Again, that will be on January 8th if you're looking for something in the new year and really hoping to settle into this work. Another opportunity happening with Pendle Hill, who is doing having a lot of opportunities around this circle, is they're hosting their Beyond Diversity 101 conference, March 19th through 29th. So it is right after our Spring Lobby weekend. So it will be with 2 speakers. I know they have done it beforehand. Alicia and I will actually be attending this year. And I have heard wonderful wonderful things about this opportunity. So I encourage you, if you are led, to attend. And so those are 3 directly related to this work of Quakers Uprooting Racism. And the final event that I want to share about is next month and a couple of weeks, we will have our next Quaker Changemaker series, which will be on community's discernment around FCNL's legislative priorities. So this is a process that some of you may have been involved in before, but this is how FCNL connects with Quakers across the country to guide the work that we are doing here on Capitol Hill. It is a process that takes us asking meetings, yearly meetings, monthly meetings, and then you respond. So there will be more information about that at the end of January, January 31st. And I will pass it over to Alicia for our closing outro.
That's all I have. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to Linnea. Thank you to Lauren. Thank you for Micah for your support, and have a great night, and we will be in touch soon.